Hello and welcome to the RPG Blender, where we give lesser played games and forgotten settings the roll of the dice they deserve. I'm your host, Game Master George, and today we are officially in October. And you know what that means? It means it's time for me to hide in a closet because I'm a coward and hate all of this scary crap. Scary movies? Can't stand them. Scary video games give me nightmares. But the one aspect of horror that I enjoy is horror role-playing games. There's nothing that I like more than the look on a player's face when you can really capture the feeling of horror in one of your games. So with that in mind, I thought it might be useful to take a look at some of the common pitfalls that people have when they're trying to run a horror game for their group. So this month we'll be taking a look at 5 different aspects to running a horror game, which will often serve as hurdles that you'll need to overcome. We'll talk about the problem itself, as well as some solutions that you can use in order to get past it. And finally, for each section, we'll talk about a game that I feel exemplifies this topic. So make sure that you've subscribed and click that notification bell to be made aware when the next parts go live. But for today, let's dive right into this with running a horror game, setting the tone. So I'm choosing to start with setting the tone because it is the first point that you're going to run into when you're trying to run your game. It is the one that has the greatest impact because it's the first interaction that your players are going to have with this. It's what you need to set up before the game even begins in order to make sure that your players are understanding what they're getting into and acting appropriately. You as the game master need to make sure that your players understand that this is not their standard game. In a normal game, it is perfectly fine for your players to just talk through their actions in combat without really narrating every single thing that they do. It's okay for them to interject with a little humorous aside. But in a horror game, those kinds of actions draw players out of the experience. They ruin it for everybody else who might be trying to get really into the tone. So it's important that you stress to your players at the beginning that you're attempting to create an air of horror, that they shouldn't be just approaching this as a normal adventure. So how can you do this? Well, for starters, you need to start from session 0. You can't introduce a horrific experience halfway through the campaign and expect your players to suddenly switch gears. You need to have been maintaining that tone for the entirety of the experience. Otherwise, your players are going to be in habits that they're going to have a very hard time breaking out of. So at the beginning of session 0, when you sit down with them and are making characters, talking about house rules, and all that other good stuff, you want to try to set the tone. It's important that you let them know up front that the descriptions that you're going to go through are vital to the experience. That the creatures, not all of them might be fightable. They're going to really need to take a more realistic approach to these things. These items we're going to get into later in this month, and you'll get a little more information on them. But what's important right now is making sure that your players understand that you are attempting to create something that has a real heavy atmosphere to it. It's also important to understand that not all your players might be into this. So don't be afraid to let a player sit a game out if they're not into all the horror stuff. But it's important that you establish the tone. Let them know from step 1 that you're going to be bringing in these elements and that you would like them to try to dive into them rather than just the board gamey elements. If you don't do this, your players will have a very hard time keeping up with you and keeping in the scene as you would like them to. This also applies to you. When you're trying to run a horror game, there can be funny moments, there can be moments of levity, but you need to also maintain this gravitas throughout. If your players are told that they're going in for a horror game, and then they get halfway through it and all of a sudden the monster ends up being a bad pun, the tone is going to shift and you're not going to be able to reclaim that tone. This is something that you need to set from the beginning and you need to maintain throughout. This adds an extra level of policing to your play as the game master. You're not just monitoring the rules or the monsters, the actions, the background stuff. You're also making sure that your players are keeping within the tone of the game. If the players start going off the rails, if the phones come out, if they start making their out-of-character jokes more often, you need to try to gently remind them. that this is a much more immersive experience that you're trying to generate here. So, what else can you do in order to cement this tone in their minds? First thing that I would recommend, no computers. Not for you, not for your players. No screens of any kind. Screens bring distractions. Yes, that is a normal thing in role playing games. It's something that we always fight with. But in this, they also bring extra light. And as we know, your imagination runs more freely when it's dark. And these lights from your screens, they serve to ground them in reality. As such, by taking away those screens, by making them unable to use them, not only do you remove a potential distraction, you also remove a source of solace from this experience. Going along with that, don't play with your lights on full bore. Make sure that you've dimmed them down when they're playing. There's still enough that they can see their sheets, but if the entire room is lit up like I am right now, it's not going to help with the atmosphere that you're trying to set. Many game masters will use sound effects music in the background in order to set a scene. With the sounds, this is the one exception to the no screens rule. Something that is a device for you to be able to play your soundtrack on. Dim the screen as low as you possibly can while still being able to see it, and then load up any of the hundreds of Halloween background tracks that you can find online for free. I'll include a link to one or two in the description. If you use that, put it very faintly in the background. Most of the time you want your players to not even notice that it's playing. When you get to a climactic moment, be ready on that volume slider to just nudge it up ever so slightly. It punctuates the moment and really solidifies it in your players' minds. So we have 4 things for you to work on here to set your tone. First, you want to be discussing it with your players up front, letting them know the tone that you're trying to set and asking them to keep the normal shenanigans to a minimum. Second, you want to be removing their screens to remove that disconnect from your world that you're setting, to remove that place of safety for them. Third, you want to dim the lights to remove the visibility, to allow their minds to more freely wander. And fourth, you want to have some background sounds going in order to set the tone. So now, what game do I think exemplifies this? This is a very easy one. This is actually probably the easiest of any of them that I have to determine here, and that is the game of 10 Candles. 10 Candles is a horror role-playing game where your players cannot win. At the end of the story, your characters will die. That is a known fact. There is nothing that they can do to prevent this. This sets the tone from the very beginning. They know that their players are heading to oblivion, and it makes it much more about the connections and the stories that they tell along the way. Having this hopeless atmosphere, but trying to grab some hope from it. That said, the main fixture of this game is the 10 candles. At the beginning of the game, you'll start with no lights in the room, except for 10 small candles in the center of the table. What your players will do then is at certain moments, when things become just a little bit worse, when the world turns a little bit darker, one of the 10 candles will be extinguished. When the last candle goes out, that's when the game ends, and the world is over. Making the immersion even better. Along the way, your players will burn away parts of their character sheet, dropping them into the flame of the candle and watching them burn away. This is true perfect immersion built into the tone of this game. From beginning to end, the setting, the system, everything is designed to set the tone. Something hopeless, something dark and depressing, but with moments of hope that they can try to wrench from the darkness. And that is what you need to try to do when you are setting the tone of your own game. You need to set this dark atmosphere. You need your players to understand that bad things are going to happen, that this is not like a standard Dungeons and Dragons game where they can go in, defeat the evil, and emerge victorious. No, this is a game where bad things will happen. Bad things will happen to people they know, and bad things will happen to them. But it's not about the bad things. It's about the struggle. It's about trying to find their moments of triumph before everything burns away. And the way to do that is to set the tone from the beginning, remove their disconnects by removing the screens, reduce the lights to let their minds flow, and to immerse them with some soft, thematic sounds. If you do that, you can have a good framework for your horror game. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I hope it's given you a little bit of a peek into how you can set the tone for your own horror game. Next week, we'll be talking about another aspect that I find is something that trips people up when it comes to running a horror game. So come back next week for part 2 of these 5 tips on how to run a horror game. But for now, thank you so much for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe. Let us know what you thought about this. Have you ever run a horror game? What did you do in order to set the tone? Did your players rebel against it, or did they dive into the tone that you set? Let us know in the comments below, and come back next week for the next part of this tutorial. If you enjoy our show, you could also check out our Twitch at twitch.tv/rpgblender. We've got some gaming content going up there now, but we'll be introducing some tabletop experiences in the near future, so please go make sure that you've followed to be notified when those happen. Anyway, thank you again, and remember, there's gaming outside the Forgotten Realms.